This is this is series 2, Migration, Displacement, and Survival. The core question that we ask ourselves in series 2 is, what forces push people to flee and what does survival look like after displacement? The abstract of series 2 is, this series investigates the human stories behind migration, focusing on Latin American communities navigating violence, poverty, and climate collapse. It connects displacement to U.S. foreign policy, economic exploitation, and environmental degradation, showing how survival becomes both resistance and adaptation. The essays highlight trauma, resilience, and moral responsibility of nations that shape migration patterns, reframing. The essays highlight trauma, resilience, and the moral responsibility of nations that shape migration patterns, reframing refugee not as a choice, but as a necessity. This is Article 2 of Series 2, Rags to Riches, the Myth of Stability for Immigrant Families. Poverty doesn't disappear overnight, redefining making it. Written and narrated by Jessica Vasquez-Lund. The United States has long celebrated a particular kind of immigrant story, the one where a person arrives with nothing, works tirelessly, and eventually makes it. It's a narrative repeated by politicians, taught in classrooms, and internalized by families who feel pressured to embody it. Yet, this rags to riches storyline does not reflect the lived experience of most immigrant families. Instead, it flattens struggle, obscures structural barriers, and turns survival into a performance. For many Latino immigrants, the journey is not about achieving wealth or upward mobility. It's about navigating trauma, instability, and institutions that were never designed with them in mind. The myth rests on the assumption that poverty is temporary and can be overcome through individual effort. Research consistently contradicts this belief. Carlos Villalobos-Varias' analysis of inequality and structural change in Latin America shows that immigrant families often remain concentrated in low-wage sectors due to systemic barriers such as legal status restrictions, discrimination, and limited access to educational opportunities. These barriers are not reflections of personal shortcomings. They are the predictable outcomes of policy decisions. When a person works multiple jobs and still cannot afford healthcare, childcare, or stable housing, the issue is not effort, it is the structure surrounding their labor. The narrative also ignores the psychological weight immigrants carry with them. Many arrive after surviving violence, displacement, or political instability. Minja Lee's research on transnational stress proliferation demonstrates that pre-migration trauma and post-migration stressors compound one another, producing chronic stress that affects mental and physical health long after arrival. Similarly, Barton finds that Latinx young adults who experience trauma before migration face heightened. Similarly, Barton et al. find. Similarly, oh my God. Similarly, Barton that. Okay, I'm starting over. The narrative also ignores the psychological weight immigrants carry with them. Many arrive after surviving violence, displacement, or political instability. Minja Lee's research on transnational stress proliferation demonstrates that pre-migration trauma and post-migration stressors combine one another, producing chronic stress that affects mental and physical health long after arrival. Similarly, Barton found that Latinx young adults who experience trauma before migration face heightened accumulative stress, especially when their pre-migration assets, such as education or community ties, are disrupted. These emotional burdens do not disappear simply because someone crosses a border, yet the myth demands gratitude, silence, and resilience without acknowledging the cost of carrying such histories. Even when immigrant families achieve a degree of stability, it is often precarious. A single medical emergency, job loss, or shift in immigration policy can unravel years of progress. This fragility is not accidental. It's embodied in the structure of low-wage labor markets, where immigrants are disproportionately represented in sectors with limited protections and little upward mobility. Studies on immigrant labor patterns show that Latino immigrants are overrepresented in essential but undervalued industries, agriculture, construction, and domestic work and food service, where exploitation is common and advancement rare. Stability, when it exists, is often one crisis away from collapse. The rags to riches myth also erases the collective nature of immigrant survival. Families pool resources, share housing, rotate childcare, and support relatives across borders. Remittances. Hold on. The rags to riches myth also erases the collective nature of immigrant survival. Families pool resources, share housing, rotate childcare, and support relatives across borders. Remittances sustain entire communities in Latin America. These acts of mutual aid are not signs of failure, they are strategies of resilience, but the myth centers individual achievement, ignoring the communal labor that makes survival possible. Research on immigrant family dynamics, including Oritz's systemic review of intergenerational conflict, shows that children of immigrants often feel pressure to repay their parents' sacrifices by achieving a version of success defined by American capitalism. When they struggle, they internalize shame rather than recognizing the structural forces shaping their lives. This pressure has consequences. A growing body of research, including studies published in Social Science and Medicine and the Journal of Latinx Psychology, shows that second-generation Latino youth frequently experience anxiety, burnout, and identity conflict as they attempt to reconcile family expectations with systemic barriers. Lincoln Howe and Pong's work on educational mobility further demonstrate that schools often fail to provide the support necessary for disadvantaged immigrant children to achieve upward mobility. Despite the myth that education alone guarantees success, the narrative becomes a burden passed down through generations, shaping identity and self-worth. Rejecting the rags to riches myth does not mean rejecting ambition or hope. It means telling the truth. Immigrant success is not linear. It is nonlinear, collective, and shaped by forces far beyond individual control. It's the story of people who rebuild their lives in the aftermath of trauma, who navigate systems designed to exclude them, who create community where none existed, and who survive despite the odds. Not because the odds were fair. The real immigrant story is not about riches. It is about resilience, adaptation, and the quiet everyday work of building stability in a world that can constantly. The real immigrant story is not about riches. It's about resilience, adaptation, and the quiet everyday work of building stability in a world that constantly shifts beneath your feet. And that story deserves to be told honestly. The works cited in this piece are Barton A., Novio Au, Sanchez M., Romano E., and Cano M. Impact of Pre-Migration Assets and Pre-Migration Trauma on Cumulative Stress Among Recent Latinx Immigrant Young Adults, Ethnicity and Health, Volume 27, Number 6, 2022. Howe, Lincoln, and Susan Lin Pong. The Role of School in the Upward Mobility of Disadvantaged Immigrant Children. The Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, Volume 620, Number 1, 2008. Li Minjiao, Pre-Migration Trauma and Post-Migration Stressors for Asian and Latino American Immigrants, Transnational Stress Proliferation, Social Indicators Research, Volume 129, 2016. Oritz Grossa M., Intergenerational Conflicts Between Latino Immigrant Parents and First Generation, U.S.-born children seeking higher education, a systemic review of the literature. California State University, Long Beach, 2024. Social Mobility and Immigrants in the United States, Migration Policy Institute 2010, Torres Lucas, Accumulative Stress, Depression, and the Moderating Role of Education in Latino Immigrants, Hispanic Journal of Behavioral Science, says Volume 35, Number 3, 2013. And Vargas Edward D., Immigration Policies in Mixed Status Families, The Psychological Effects of Policy Threat, Social Science and Medicine, Volume 185, 2017. Now we'll be going into the reflection of Article 2, Series 2, Rags to Riches, The Myth of Stability for Immigrant Families. This series is about stories beneath the surface, the ones that don't make it into political speeches or neat little narratives about the American dream. Today's reflection, Rags to Riches, The Myth of Stability, is about the pressure immigrant families carry, the truth behind the stories we're told to believe, and the reality of what survival might actually look like. Nope. Okay. Today's reflection, Rags to Riches, The Myth of Stability, is about the pressure immigrant families carry, the truth behind the stories we're told to believe, and the reality of what survival actually looks like. Let's get into it. So, they kind of love to tell a certain story about us, and by they, I mean the media. It's the one where immigrants arrive with nothing. They work hard, keep quiet, and somehow rise into the glow of the American dream. It's a story polished enough for classrooms and inspiring enough for campaign speeches, but simple enough to make people believe that struggle is temporary and success is guaranteed if you just grind hard enough. But that story is a myth that flattens families into symbols and that turns survival into performance. That demands gratitude while ignoring the weight that families carry. Because the truth is, most immigrant families aren't climbing ladders, they're dodging falling debris. The myth says poverty's a phase, but the research says otherwise. Legal status restrictions, discrimination, schools that don't have the resources, jobs that pay too little and demand too much. You can work 3 jobs, send money home, skip meals so your kids don't have to, and still be one emergency away from losing everything. That's not a lack of effort, that's a system built on extraction. And then there's the trauma, the part of the story that America wants to hold. The violence people flee, the instability they survive. Shit. And then there's the trauma, the part of the story that America never wants to hold. It's the violence that people flee, the instability they survive, the memories that follow them across borders, years, across every attempt to rebuild. Pre-migration trauma doesn't vanish because you cross a checkpoint. Post-migration stress doesn't disappear because you found a job. People carry histories in their bodies, histories that don't fit neatly into the grateful immigrant narrative this country loves to celebrate. And even stability, when it does come, it's fragile. One illness, one layoff, one policy change, and the ground shifts again. Immigrants are overrepresented in the jobs that this country calls essential, but treats as disposable. Agriculture, construction, domestic work, food service. And that work that keeps America running is the work that's the least protected. And the people who do it are expected to be grateful for the chance to survive. And still, they do survive, but not the way that the myth imagines. They survive through each other, through the shared apartments and rotating childcare and the community that stretch across borders like lifelines. Through collective labor, through the quiet agreements that keep families afloat when institutions refuse to. But the myth doesn't honor that. It centers the individual, the lone hero who made it. And when the next generation struggles, they don't blame the system, they blame themselves. And the pressure is real, the cost is real, and the myth is heavy. Second generation youth carry it like a debt to succeed, to repay sacrifice, to prove their parents' suffering was worth it. But how do you make it in a system that was never designed for you to rise? And how do you chase stability when the ground beneath you keeps shifting? Rejecting the myth. It's not rejecting hope, but it is reclaiming truth. So immigrant success, it just isn't starting over. Rejecting the myth. It's not rejecting hope, but it is reclaiming truth. Immigrant success is not linear. It's not a straight line from struggle to triumph. It is non-linear, collective, messy, and shaped by forces far beyond individual control. It's the story of people who oh my God. Why can't I talk today? It's the story of people who rebuild after trauma. Oh my God. Ugh. It's the story of people who rebuild after trauma, who navigate systems built to exclude them, who create community where none existed, who survive not because the odds were fair, but because they refused to disappear. The real immigrant story is not rags to riches. It is resilience to survival, adaptation to endurance, truth to power. And the story, our story, deserves to be told honestly. Thank you for listening and for holding this truth with me. The rags to riches myth was never written for us, but our real stories, the ones rooted in resilience, community, are powerful enough to rewrite the narrative. Thanks for listening and thinking with me. I appreciate you being here and see you in the next one.